We know that one of our strategies for changing a fraction to a decimal is to divide. So we have 5 divided by 8. And you can kind of think about an ice cream cone to help you figure out how to set up your division problem. So this is a freezer, and your ice cream here goes inside of the freezer so that it can stay cold, and your cone will go outside of the freezer. So you have 5 divided by 8, your numerator divided by your denominator. Well, 8 cannot go into 5, so I'm going to put a 0, and I'm going to add a decimal, bring my decimal up and add a 0. 8 goes into 50 6 times. 6 times 8 is 48. We subtract and get 2. After we've added a decimal, we can always continue to add more zeros, so I'm going to add another 0 and bring it down. 8 goes into 20 2 times. 2 times 8 is 16. We'll subtract and get 4. I can add another 0 and bring it down. 8 goes into 40 5 times. 5 times 8 is 40. We subtract and get 0. So our decimal equivalent to 5/8 is going to be 625 thousandths. Now another way we could have looked at this is we could have asked ourselves, can we multiply our denominator of 8 by a number to get 10, 100, or 1,000? Well, we can actually multiply 8 times 125, and we would get 1,000. Whatever we do to the denominator, we need to do to the numerator, so 5 times 125. So let's do that over here. 125 times 5. 5 times 5 is 25. 5 times 2 is 10, plus 2 would be 12. 5 times 1 is 5, plus 1 would be 6. So we get 625 thousandths, which will be written as 625 thousandths. And as you can see, the first strategy we used and the second strategy we used, we got the same answer. Now we have a mixed fraction, 5 and 12/20. Well, since I have a whole number, I'm going to go ahead and write that over here. And now I'm just going to look at the fraction, 12/20. Well, we know that we can divide a fraction to get a decimal. So I'm going to use this little ice cream again to kind of help me set up my problem. The ice cream goes inside the freezer. The cone goes outside. So 12 divided by 20. My numerator divided by my denominator. 20 does not go into 1. It does not go into 12. So I'm going to add a decimal. Bring that decimal up and add a 0. 20 goes into 120 6 times. 6 times 20 is 120. We subtract and get 0. So I have 6/10. So my answer would be 5 and 6/10. Now let's think about our other strategy and see if it works. 12/20. Can I multiply 20 by a number to get 10, 100, or 1,000? Well, I know 20 times 5 equals 100. What I do to my denominator, I do to my numerator. 12 times 5 is 60, and I get 60 hundredths. So I could have written 5 and 60 hundredths, which is equivalent to what we got earlier, because if I added a 0 onto 6/10, I could now have 5 and 60 hundredths. When you're converting a decimal to a fraction, the way you say it is the way that you're going to write it. So let's say this, 7 and 98 hundredths, because it ends in the hundredths place. So we have 7 and 98 hundredths. Okay, And we always want to think, can we simplify this? Well, I know that 98 and 100 are both even, so they're both divisible by 2. So we now have 7, and we know that 100 divided by 2 is 50. Let's go ahead and do the math for 98 divided by 2. 2 goes into 9 4 times. 4 times 2 is 8. We subtract and get 1. Bring down our 8. 2 goes into 18. 9 times. 9 times 2 is 18. Subtract and get 0. So we get 7 and 49/50ths. We can't simplify any more, so that is our answer. Again, the way we say it is the way we're going to write it. So this is said 5 hundredths because the 5 is in the hundredths place. So 5 hundredths. There's no need to write a whole number because I do not have a whole number. Now let's see, can we simplify? Let's see here. 5 and 100 are both divisible by 5, so yes, we can simplify. 5 divided by 5 is 1. 100 divided by 5 is 20. So 1/20 will be your answer. For part B, we are going to order these decimals from least to greatest. So if you look at number 1, you notice that we have some fractions along with decimals. So it would be kind of difficult to order these since they're not all the same. So let's go ahead and change our fractions to decimals. So we have 4/10. Well, we already see that our denominator is 10, and that's going to be a place value, tenths. So we'll write that as 4/10. Then we have 1 and 1/2. We know that 1 is going to be our whole number, so I'm going to put that before the decimal. And let's think, can I multiply 2 by a number to get 10, 100, or 1,000? Well, I know that 2 times 5 is 10. Whatever I do to the denominator, I'm going to do to my numerator. 1 times 5 is 5. And I have 5/10. So I'm going to write the 5 in the tenths place. Now that all of our numbers are decimals, I'm going to go ahead and line these up vertically so that it's easier for me to compare them. So I have 1 and 7/10, 1 and 15 hundredths. 4/10 we converted to a decimal, so 4/10. 2 and 65 hundredths, 39 hundredths. And 1 and 1/2 we converted to 1 and 5/10. So all of my decimals are lined up. I have a number in the ones place, I have numbers in the tenths place, and then a few of my decimals don't have numbers in the hundredths place, so I'm going to add a 0 so that everything looks nice and pretty and I can compare them very easily. So let's start in the ones place. And remember, we're going from least to greatest, so we want to find the smallest number in the ones place. Well, I notice 2 of my decimals have zeros in the ones place, so now I'm going to look in the tenths place. So what is smaller, 3/10 or 4/10? Well, 3/10 is smaller, so this will be first, and this is going to be second. All right, let's go back to our ones place. I noticed that this decimal, and this decimal all have ones in the ones place. So I'm going to go to my tenths place. 7/10, 1/10, and 5/10. 1/10 is the smallest, so that's my next number. 5/10 is the next smallest, so that will be my fourth number. And then 7/10 was the largest of those 3, so that will be my fifth number. And going back to our ones place, we notice that 2 is the largest number in the ones place, so that will be last. So I'll go ahead and write these out. We have 39 hundredths. We have 4/10. We have 1 and 1500ths. We have 1 1/2. We have 1 7/10. And last, 2 6500ths. Now let's go ahead and place our answers from number 1 on a number line. So our smallest number was 3900ths. We know that's going to be between 0 and 1. And we can count each little tick mark by hundredths. So we have 10 hundredths, 20 hundredths, 30 hundredths, 40 hundredths. Well, 39 hundredths is going to be really close to 40 hundredths, so right before it. So we're going to say right here. So that is going to be 39 hundredths. 4 tenths, we converted earlier to 4 tenths. And if I wanted to, I can add a 0 to that 4 tenths, and I'll have 40 hundredths, which will be right next to 39 hundredths. So we have 40 hundredths. Our next number is 1 1500ths. I know that's going to be between 1 and 2. So same thing as earlier, we can count by hundredths. So we have 1 10 hundredths, 1 20 hundredths. So I know that's going to be right in between 1 15 hundredths. Our next number is 1 1/2, which earlier we converted to 1 5 tenths. And I can add a 0 on to make it 1 50 hundredths. So we'll keep counting. So we had 1 10 hundredths, 1 20 hundredths, 1 30 hundredths, 1 40 hundredths, 1 50 hundredths. Next we have 1 7 tenths, or we could say 1 70 hundredths. So we'll keep counting. So 1 60 hundredths, 1 70 hundredths. And our last one, 2 65 hundredths. We know that's between 2 and 3. So we'll keep counting. So 2 10 hundredths, 2 20 hundredths, 2 30 hundredths, 2 40 hundredths, 2 50 hundredths, 2 60 hundredths, 2 70 hundredths. We know that's going to be right in between. So we have 2 65 hundredths. Again, we're going to be ordering our decimals from least to greatest. So I like to always line my decimals up vertically. So I have 98 hundredths. I have 16 hundredths. I have 6 hundredths. I have 62 thousandths, 75 hundredths, and 7 tenths. And I like to go ahead and add zeros so that all of my decimals end in the same place value. All right, so let's go ahead and compare starting in the ones place. We notice that all of our numbers in the ones place are zeros. So let's go to the next place value, our tenths place. And in the tenths place, we have zeros as our smallest number. Well, we have 2 of them, so we need to go to the next place value, our hundredths. Well, I have 6 hundredths and 6 hundredths. So once again, I need to go to the next place value. So we're going to go to our thousandths. We have 60 thousandths, 62 thousandths. 60 thousandths is smaller, so that's going to be our first number. And 62 thousandths will be our second number. All right, let's go back to the tenths place. The smallest number in the tenths place next would be 1 tenth. So this will be our next decimal. All right, so back to looking at the tenths place, we have 7 tenths and 7 tenths. So let's go to the next place value, our hundredths place. So 75 hundredths, 70 hundredths. Well, we know that 70 hundredths is smaller, so that's going to be our 4th number, and this will be our 5th number. And then our last number that we have, 9, is the largest number in the tenths place, so that one will be last. So we have 6 hundredths, 62 thousandths, 16 hundredths, 7 tenths, 75 hundredths, and last, 98 hundredths. In part C, we're going to be multiplying decimals. So first, let's go ahead and see how many numbers are behind the decimals in both factors. So 3 and 5 tenths has one number behind the decimal. 6 and 2 tenths has one number behind the decimal. And if I add them together, I get 2. So my answer, my product, needs to have 2 numbers behind the decimal. Now I'm going to write my factors as whole numbers. And let's not worry about the decimals right now. Let's just go ahead and multiply if they were whole numbers. So 2 times 5 is 10. 2 times 3 is 6 plus 1 would give us 7. Before we multiply by the 6, we need to add a placeholder. 6 times 5 is 30. 6 times 3 is 18. Plus 3 would give us 21. And we'll go ahead and add those up. We get 0, 7, 1, 2. And remember from earlier, we decided that we are going to need to have 2 numbers behind our decimal in our answer. So we have 1, 2. There's my decimal. So my product will be 21 and 70 hundredths. For number 2, we're going to do the same thing that we did for number 1. So first we are going to count the numbers behind the decimal in both of our factors. So our first factor, 1 and 25 hundredths, has 2 numbers behind the decimal. And our second factor, 19 hundredths, also has 2 numbers behind the decimal. So altogether, our answer should have 4 numbers behind the decimal. So let's go ahead and write our factors as whole numbers. Don't worry about the decimals right now. And let's go ahead and multiply. 9 times 5 is going to give us 45. 9 times 2 is 18, plus 4 is 22. 9 times 1 is 9, plus 2 is 11. Before we multiply by the 1, we need to add a placeholder. 1 times 5 is 5. 1 times 2 is 2. 1 times 1 is 1, and we'll go ahead and add up. And we get 5, 7, 3, 2. And remember, we need to make sure that we put the decimal in our product, and we should have 4 numbers behind the decimal. And if you want to add a 0 before the decimal, you can. So we have 2,375 10,000ths. We will do the same thing for number 3 that we've done for number 1 and number 2. So let's go ahead and count the numbers behind the decimal in both of our factors. So 6 and 2 tenths has 1 number behind the decimal, and 9 and 4 hundredths has 2 numbers behind the decimal. So altogether, my answer should have 3 numbers behind the decimal. So let's go ahead and write this as whole numbers. 162 times 904. 4 times 2 is 8. 4 times 6 is 24. 4 times 1 is 4, plus 2 would give us 6. Before I multiply by the 0, we need to put 1 placeholder. 0 times 2 is 0. 0 times 6 is 0. And 0 times 1 is 0. Before we multiply by the 9, now we need to have 2 placeholders. 9 times 2 is 18. 9 times 6 is 54, plus 1 is 55. 9 times 1 is 9, plus 5 would give us 14. Let's go ahead and add up. We get 8, 4, 14, 6, 4, 1. And don't forget, our answer, our product, needs to have 3 numbers behind the decimal. So our answer will be 146 and 448 thousandths. For part D, we are going to be dividing decimals, and if it's necessary, you need to round to the nearest thousandths. So for number 1, let's go ahead and write our problem. So the first number always needs to go inside the division symbol. So 19 and 4/10 divided by 6/10. So we have our dividend divided by our divisor. Now we need to think, is our divisor a whole number? Well, we notice that it's 6/10, so if we move the decimal one time to the right, we now have 6, so it's now a whole number. Whatever you do to the divisor, you do the exact same thing to your dividend. So we're going to move the decimal one time to the right. Now I'm going to go ahead and rewrite my problem. So I have 194 divided by 6. And I'm just going to go ahead and bring this decimal straight up. 6 cannot go into 1, but it can go into 19 3 times. 3 times 6 is 18. We'll subtract and get 1. Next, we'll bring down our 4. 6 goes into 14 2 times. 2 times 6 is 12. We'll subtract and get 2. Since we have a decimal right here, we can go ahead and add as many zeros after that as we want. So we'll add a 0 and bring it down. 6 goes into 20 3 times. 3 times 6 is 18. We'll subtract and get 2. We will add a 0 and bring it down. 6 goes into 20 3 times. 3 times 6 is 18. We subtract, we get 2. Add another 0, bring it down. And 6 goes into 20 3 times. And if you notice, we're going to have a repeating decimal. We're going to keep getting 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3 after the decimal. So let's go ahead and round. So I'm going to write 32 and 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, and it would just keep going. And we're going to round to the nearest thousandths place. So this is tenths, hundredths, thousandths. So I'm going to go to the next place value, my 10 thousandths, and I'm going to ask myself, is that number in the 10 thousandths place 5 or more or 4 or less? If it's 5 or more, you'll raise the score of your thousandths place. If it's 4 or less, you're going to let it rest. You'll let the thousandths place rest. Well, since 3 is going to be less than 4, we're going to let our thousandths place rest. So we're going to keep it a 3. So our answer, when we round it, is going to be 32 and 333 thousandths. All right, let's go ahead and set up number 2. Our first number goes inside, which is our dividend, 3 6/10, divided by our divisor, which is 864 thousandths. Now, is our divisor a whole number? We notice that it's not, so we're going to move our decimal until it becomes a whole number. So 1, 2, 3. Whatever you do to the divisor, you're going to do the exact same thing to your dividend. So 1, 2, 3. Now you'll notice you have these little empty loop-de-loops. So we're going to add 2 zeros. Okay. So our new problem is going to be 3,600 divided by 864. I'm just going to go ahead and bring this decimal straight up. Now let's go ahead and divide. So 864 cannot go into 3, so I'm going to put a 0. It can't go into 36, so I'm going to put a 0. It can't go into 360, so I'm going to put a 0. Now, how many times does it go into 3,600? Well, it'll go in there 4 times. And 4 times 864 is 3,456. And we'll go ahead and subtract. So we're going to have to do some borrowing here. So we'll go to the next place value. There's still nothing there. We'll go to the next place value, and we'll borrow from the 6. 6 becomes a 5. 0 becomes a 10. Now we can borrow from the 10. 10 will now become a 9. And this 0 become a 10. So 10 take away 6 is 4. 9 take away 5 is going to be 4. 5 take away 4 is 1, and 3 take away 3 will be 0. Now, since we have a decimal right here, we can go ahead and add a 0 so that we can bring a 0 down. Now, how many times does 864 go into 1,440? Well, that will be 1 time. 1 times 864 will give us 864. Let's go ahead and subtract. We'll borrow from this 4. The 4 will become a 3, and the 0 will become a 10. 10 minus 4 is 6. We're going to have to borrow again, so 4 becomes a 3. This 3 becomes a 13. 13 take away 6 is 7. We're going to have to borrow one last time. This 0, or this 1 becomes a 0, and the 3 will become a 13. And 13 take away 8 is going to be 5. We will go ahead and add another 0 and bring it down. Now, how many times does 864 go into 5,760? That will be 6 times. 6 times 864 will be 5,184. Let's go ahead and subtract. We'll borrow from the 6. The 6 will become a 7. Or, sorry, 6 will become a 5. And our 0 will become a 10. 10 minus 4 is 6. We're going to have to borrow again. Our 7 will become a 6, and 5 will become 15. 15 take away 8 will give us 7. 6 take away 1 is 5, and 5 take away 5 is 0. And we'll add a 0 and bring it down. Well, if you notice earlier, we had 5,760, and once again we have 5,760. So that's going to go in there 6 times. And we're going to go ahead and have a repeating decimal. So I'm going to go ahead and write that. 4 and 1, 6, 6, 6, 6 keeps repeating. Well, we want to round to the nearest thousandths place, because remember, tenths, hundredths, thousandths. So I'm going to look to the next place value, my 10,000ths place. And I'm going to ask myself, is it 5 or more or 4 or less? Well, since it's more than 5, it's going to be 5 or more, so we're going to raise the score. So the 6 will become a 7. So we'll have 4 and 167 thousandths. All right, so let's go ahead and set up problem number 3. Our first number is our dividend. It's always going to be the one that goes inside of the division symbol. The first one goes in first. So 1 and 536 thousandths divided by 48 hundredths. All right, so is the divisor a whole number? Well, since it's not, we're going to move the decimal until it becomes a whole number. So 1, 2. Now let's go ahead and do the exact same thing to the dividend. We're going to move it 1, 2. So let's go ahead and rewrite this. 153 and 6/10 divided by 48. Well, we know that 48 does not go into 1, so we're going to put a 0. 48 does not go into 15, so I'm going to put a 0. 48 will go into 153 3 times. 48 times 3 will give you 144. We'll go ahead and subtract. Borrow from the 5. 5 becomes a 4. The 3 will become 13. 13 take away 4 is 9. 4 take away 4 is 0. And 1 take away 1 is 0. Oh, and if you noticed earlier, I forgot to bring my decimals straight up. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And we'll go ahead and bring the 6 down. So 48 goes into 96 2 times. And 2 times 48 is 96. We'll go ahead and subtract and we get 0. So our answer is 3 2/10. So my question here is to find the distance between Eli's school. So here's Eli. His school and his home. Well, we know that Kyra and Eli are close friends studying in the same school. Kyra's home is 44 8/10 miles away from school. So we'll do that. So Kyra, so school to home is 4 8/10 miles. And then we know that Eli's home is 3.5 times as far as Kyra's home. So it's 3.5 times as far as that distance. So we know we need to multiply. So we're going to multiply 4 8/10 times 3.5. Well, first let's go ahead and count the numbers behind the decimal. We have 1 here, 1 here. So altogether, my answer should have 2 numbers behind the decimal. So let's go ahead and write our decimals as whole numbers. So 48 times 35. 5 times 8 is 40. 5 times 4 is 20, plus 4 is 24. Before we multiply by 3, we put 1 placeholder. 3 times 8 is 24. 3 times 4 is 12, plus 2 would give you 14. Let's go ahead and add 0, 8, 6, 1. Remember, our answer should have 2 numbers behind the decimal. So we know that Eli's school or home is 16 80 miles from school. Our next question is, what is the length of each part? And we know that each part means 1 part. So Kate splits a rope that was 49 4/10 inches into 4 equal parts. So we know we're taking this total amount and we're cutting it into 4 equal parts, or splitting it, or we could say dividing. So we're taking our total amount, 49 4/10, and we're taking that total and dividing it by 4 so that we can figure out how much just one part will be. So 4 goes into 4. Oh, before I get started, I forgot to bring my decimals straight up. So 4 goes into 4 one time. 1 times 4 is 4. Subtract and get 0. Bring down your 9. 4 goes into 9 2 times. 2 times 4 is 8. Subtract and get 1. We'll go ahead and bring down the 4. 4 goes into 14 3 times. 3 times 4 is 12. Subtract and get 2. Add a 0 and bring that 0 down. 4 goes into 20 5 times. 5 times 4 is 20. We subtract and get 0. So we know that each part, or one part, will be 12 35 inches long. Our third question says, how much did Miss Elliott pay total? Okay, well, Miss Elliott bought 1 5/10 pounds of ground beef. And the price of ground beef is $4.10 per pound. So that means just 1 pound will equal $4.10. Well, I know I got 1.5 pounds, so I know I at least got that 1 pound for $4.10, but then I got half more. So I can go ahead and multiply here to figure out how much I got all together or total. So 4 10/10 times 1.5, or 1 5/10. So before we do that, let's count the numbers behind the decimal. So 1, 2, 1. So 2 plus 1 will give me 3. So my answer should have 3 numbers behind the decimal. All right, so let's go ahead and multiply, but we're going to write our factors as whole numbers. All right, 5 times 0 is 0, 5 times 1 is 5, and 5 times 4 is 20. Before I multiply by the 1, we put a placeholder. 1 times 0 is 0, 1 times 1 is 1, and 1 times 4 is 4. And let's go ahead and add. We get 0, 5, 1, and 6. And don't forget, our number needs to have 3 numbers, 1, 2, 3, behind the decimal. So I paid $6.150. Oh wait, that doesn't look so right. Remember, money needs to end in the hundredths place. So we're going to round. So let's look at the next place value. Is it 5 or more? Raise the score. 4 or less? Let it rest. Well, we know it's 4 or less because 0 is less than 4. So we're going to let our 5 rest. So I paid $6.15 for 1.5 pounds of ground beef. Our last question is, how much did each gallon cost? Well, we know that each gallon means just 1 gallon. So Miss Regal purchased 12 gallons of gas for $23.82. So we know her total was $23.82. Well, if I took that total and divided it by the 12 gallons she bought, I could then figure out how much just 1 gallon was. So 12 goes into 2 0 times. 12 goes into 23 1 time. So 1 times 12 is 12. We'll go ahead and subtract. 3 minus 2 is 1. 2 minus 1 is 1. And let's go ahead and bring this decimal straight up before we forget. We'll bring our 8 down. And we'll ask ourselves, how many times does 12 go into 118? It goes in there 9 times. 9 times 12 is 108. We'll go ahead and subtract. 8 minus 8 is 0. 1 minus 0 is 1. And 1 minus 1 is 0. Bring our 2 down. 12 goes into 102 8 times. 8 times 12 is 96. We'll go ahead and subtract. We're going to have to borrow. We can't borrow from the 0, so we'll borrow from the 1. The 1 becomes a 0. The 0 becomes a 10. Now we can borrow from the 10. The 10 will become a 9, and the 2 will become a 12. 12 take away 6 is 6. 9 take away 9 is 0. So we'll go ahead and add another 0. Bring it down. 12 goes into 65 times. 5 times 12 is 60. We'll subtract and get 0. So we know that Miss Regal purchased 1 gallon for $1.985. Oh, once again, we can't have our cents looking like that. It has to end in the hundredths place. So we're going to go ahead and round. So we'll look at the next place value, our thousandths place. And is that 5 or more? Raise the score, or 4 or less? Let it rest. Well, we notice that it's going to be 5 or more, so we're going to raise the score of our 8. And we're going to raise it to a 9, so it's going to be $1.99 that Miss Regal purchased 1 gallon for.